medical device classification, and then we'll go through some of the FDA regulatory pathways. There you go. Okay. So you see this on top here. This is meant to be a very high level kind of product development process. You know, there's only 5 chevrons up there, so it's very, very high level. You realize that there's a lot of work that goes underneath each one of these. You know, so then to start, we have the device discovery and concept. And this is kind of, you know, when you first realize an unmet need, or you get feedback from the, you know, your customer base. It's kind of like the back of the napkin kind of session where you're drawing up, you know, a new device, or you have this great idea for a new device or a concept. So one thing I wanted to say is it's really important. I have a regulatory background, right? So I'm going to tell you, of course, that regulatory should be in this process really early on. It will go smooth for market release if we're brought early on into the discussions. We can shape your marketing plan. We can shape some of the testing that you'll need to do if we're brought in early. One of the examples that I have, and I know this isn't US related, but years ago when I was supporting an X-ray business, they wanted to go global, of course. And one of their ideas was to go to China, Russia, and Brazil. And you might not know this, but they're very difficult markets to get into as far as regulatory is concerned. So they came to the regulatory affairs group a couple months before they wanted to enter those markets. So it's unfortunately I had to tell them that it takes about a year and a half to enter into those markets. So it kind of blew up their regulatory plan for market release. So I just wanted to stress that you want to bring RA in as early as possible, as well as clinical affairs though too. So let's see here. So as far as preclinical research and prototype, I wanted to go to, let's see, the, so clinical research reduces harm for users. You don't want to do this for human use this early on because your product or your technique is not proven out. So you want to do all your testing in like laboratory. And this is a great time to identify some of your regulatory submissions. You want to identify your test plan. So one way that we can go to the test plan is, I wanted to jump over to the FDA website to show you the consensus standards. Let me see if I can do this quickly. I think I can do this. And then you guys can you see the recognized consensus standards for the FDA on the screen, that website?
Yep, we can see it, Martha.
Okay, good. So here's an example of the standards. We can type in as an example, and you might know this or not, 60601 is very, very popular. This will tell you, and it'll help you plan for the tests that you're going to need going forward for market realization. 60601 is just medical electrical equipment. So if you have any kind of electrical equipment that's going to be used in a medical device, you need to do the 60601 suite of testing. So I just kind of wanted to bring this to your attention. I do have the link in the presentation, and it can kind of be fun to look at what kind of standards that you might be required. So let me see if I can go back to my.
So just to kind of follow up on that.
Okay.
So these standards here are all ones that are recognized by the FDA. Not all standards are.
Oh,
So
yeah.
as you put together your test plan to kind of define what you need to do to get a regulatory approval, you'll just, for the US, you just want to hop on here and make sure that it is recognized. And if it is, it'll be, the data will generally be accepted by FDA.
Yeah, and the FDA has this column, recognition number. So when you list your standards used, with certain submissions to the FDA, you have to identify the recognition number, and that's just for the FDA. Okay. I think I can go back to this then. Okay. So the next step. So pathway to approval for the FDA in the US, it's based on risk classification. We have low, moderate, and high. And I'll get into more of that later on in the presentation. There's a couple options to use. If you're confused or you have questions on maybe your risk classification or where your product might fit in the FDA classifications, there's something that's called the Q submission process, the Q sub or the pre-sub. So this gives you an opportunity to kind of schedule a meeting with the FDA and ask questions and get feedback. I believe it's written feedback, and I think you get written feedback no matter what when you do the Q sub process. So I wanted to again go back to the, oh no, where am I? Oh, I screwed up my screen. Hang on. Darn it.
So while the author's pulling that up, just to be clear, the Q sub
sorry.
process is one where in advance of your submission or advance to doing the work directly with the FDA to get approval or clearance for your product, you can solicit feedback from the FDA, and they'll give you a meeting, a 1-hour meeting, to review the information that you've provided to the FDA, and it'll also give you written feedback. So this is helpful for companies where you're not clear on the test plan, or you're not clear on, for example, what route to take to get your product approved in the US. It gives you a method to interactively work with the FDA.
So on your screen is the Q submission process program highlighted, or can you not see that?
We cannot see your screen anymore, Martha. I think you stopped screen.
All right. Let's try that. Better? Or no? No.
Now we can see requests for feedback and meetings.
Okay, that's what I wanted to show you guys. Okay, good. Yeah, sorry for that technical difficulty on my part. So that the FDA has a lot of these guidance documents that are available online. So I just wanted to show you that they do have a guidance document, and this is what, 35 pages. And here's the table of contents. I mean, it gives you so much information in here. If you're interested in performing a Q sub with the FDA. So let me see if I can go back to the presentation. It should be okay. Let me go back here. And another pathway to use is the de novo classification, and this is used. And again, I'm going to go into deep detail later in a couple more slides on this. If you find that you have a novel medical device, so novel is, it's brand new, never been, seen before, and you find that it's not classified and you can't find any predicate or any, similar products out there, you can ask the FDA for a classification. So this is a different process that I'll be going over in a couple slides. So then for the Q-sub process, here's the content. You know, the FDA is nice enough to have that guidance, and it goes into each one of these bullet points in detail. There. The one that I wanted to focus on, the cover letter is pretty easy. You know, the rest of the stuff is detailed in the guidance. The last part, questions, it sounds so easy to ask the FDA questions, but you only have an hour with the FDA, and you want to use that time as, you know, as efficient as you possibly can. So the way that you can ask questions is, you know, is key. You want to have very clear, very specific questions to the FDA, and they will provide feedback, of course. So I wanted to give you some examples here. You know, for an example, if we look at this one here, you know, can we get FDA's feedback and guidance on pursuing a de novo request and classification pathway for this this device? You know, does the agency agree with the proposed, you know, indications for use? I don't know, Eric, maybe do you have some other examples that you can share?
Yeah, sure. So we do probably, I don't know, 10 or 15 pre-subs on a yearly basis for different companies. It really depends on what it is that the company needs to get from the FDA. But the big questions are, for example, if you're a class 2 device and you're going to enter the market through what's called a pre-market notification, an example might be, we've researched and we've suggested that we are the same as this device. Does FDA agree that this is a good predicate? Right, a good comparison for us in our submission, and that'll kind of set up your submission. Alternatively, you'll have a whole host of testing. You'll put together a test plan like Martha talked about earlier. A lot of times you'll ask a question like, we have proposed a test plan to support an approval through you know, through our submission. Does the FDA approve, you know, have feedback on the testing that we plan on including in our submission? Those are good examples of the type of questions that that can be answered.
Yep, thank you. And you'll find if you look at that guidance that there is a whole appendix that gives you examples of questions. You know, it's always good to have an example to start with. As far as timing with the FDA, you can imagine all the requests that the FDA gets. There's a couple milestones, you know, when they get your Q-sub in the mail, or, you know, you probably should FedEx it with tracking to make sure that they get it. The FDA will review it to make sure that it has the applicable information and that they could actually read the file and that kind of stuff. They have about 15 days. So the days are calendar days, not working days. The FDA usually schedules a meeting, you know, 60 to 75 days from the receipt. You can get written feedback. And then, you know, if you request a meeting with the FDA, and it's usually about, you know, 60 to 70 days out. So it's usually a 1-hour meeting. I think the FDA uses Zoom for their platform for kind of teleconferences. You know, you want to provide the FDA a presentation prior to the meeting. You want to follow up with meeting minutes. All this information is detailed in that guidance.
So I think the important thing here from a pre-sub is that you need to consider this far enough in advance, right? So if you're thinking about you're putting together a test plan or a strategy on how you're going to enter the US market, you know, this is really a process of 2 months, 2.5 months once you submit before you get the feedback and you have the call with the FDA. So you need to do this earlier on in your process, not too early, but earlier on in your process, so you allow time in your timeline to incorporate the feedback that you get.
Thank you. I wanted to put a slide in here as far as global global regulatory, you know, if you're thinking about going outside of the US, you know, things to consider. This is pretty detailed, and it might not fit for your product or the stage that you're in product development or where your company currently is. But I wanted to give you guys a good list, at least things to think about. So, you know, for project scope, you want to get a really good program description, device description. You kind of want to identify if it's a new or modified device. So if it's a brand new device, you know, the device description and marketing claims might be different than if it's a modified device, you know, like a second revision of your device. And then you probably do this anyway. You really want to look at the market business opportunity. So I put this little bubble here because I wanted to make sure that you kind of think about regulatory early on, you know, when you're just developing your business strategy. As far as this next column here is regulatory research. So it's you know, things like we want to identify what's your device classification, what regulators are you going to be working with, and what jurisdiction. A device name. Now, a device name might be different per country or, you know, market territory. Any kind of unique claims or any kind of tactical requirements where you want to get the US, for an example, you want to get the US clearance first because that'll help you, you know, go to Brazil, for an example. Sometimes if you have the US clearance, outside of the US regulators will kind of say, oh, you have the FDA clearance, you can come into our country, no problem. And then this last column here for you to kind of think about is international trade. If you're going to go global, you have to identify your country of origin, design center location if you have more than one, and you know, who's the legal manufacturer, because you can have multiple legal manufacturers. And if you're truly going global, there's some countries that won't let you that won't accept import from certain other countries. So they don't play that well together. But these are all things that you should kind of consider. It might be overkill, but I still wanted to give you that information going forward. So then we have the FDA review. You know, let's say you're filing your submission to market in the US. The path that you're going to take, it depends on the device class. So if you remember, we talked about low, moderate, and high classification. Everybody's probably heard about a 510K for moderate risk devices. If we go to a higher class, higher risk devices, you're going to do a PMA for class 3. We talked about de novo. If you're a class 1, you might have a class 1 that needs a 510K. You might have a class 1 that's exempt from pre-market notification, which means you don't need to do a 510K. This other one over here, the humanitarian device exemption, I wanted to put this in here because it is an option, but it does have a couple caveats. The device that you want to bring to market needs to have a disease condition that affects fewer than 4,000 people. And I think that's within the US.
Yeah, I think that's correct.
Yeah. So finally, in the development process, let's say you got to market, everything is going great. It's your device is out in the market, people are using it, it's great. There are still some things that need to be managed. Of course, the FDA is going to want to inspect your manufacturing location to make sure that your quality system is appropriate and you're following it. There's some problem reports that the FDA expects. First of all, the FDA expects you to have a complaint system, and from the complaints, it can spawn off into adverse event reports and corrections and removals. So you might have heard those terms, MDR, medical device, I think is report, but it can get kind of confusing because Europe just released their their new regulation MDR, so it can get confusing. And then that 806 is has to do with recalls. And then something else that the FDA has is something that's called MedSun, and you can get to this off of their website, and it kind of taps on the shoulders of healthcare providers, so doctors, nurses, whoever uses the medical device, and kind of asks them to kind of reveal any kind of medical device problems that they see that could result in a serious injury or death. It might not have happened, but it's something good to look at, so you can kind of realize what's happening out there, maybe not specific to your device, but maybe to your type of device. Okay, so that's the end of that section. So I'm wondering if we have any questions. We're about halfway through the session.
Yes, so we actually have two questions.
Okay, great.
One is what is being mentioned here today. Also, I mean, whatever's being mentioned here today on medical devices, is this also valid for diagnostics?
So I'll answer this one.
Thank you.
Generally, within the FDA's purview, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, most of the diagnostics are covered under CDRH, right? So this will work for any diagnostics that are included. So most of the diagnostics are actually classified as medical devices in the U.S. So this process will work for those. It will not work for anything on the pharmaceutical side, right? Pharmaceutical side really is specifically a separate division, as is anything that's classified as a biologic.
Great. Another question is, there are a few more coming in also, so we might be spending a little bit more time here. So another question is regarding Q-subs. What is your opinion on how advisable it is to mix on topics in one meeting? So for example, on one hand, the plausibility of classification and pathway and acceptability of a clinical plan on the other hand. So how many topics can you mix or should you mix?
I think on some of the Q-subs that I've been part of, we limit the questions. I think there's 4 or 5 questions that I kind of focus on. You don't want to give the FDA too many questions because you don't have that much time for them to answer. So, I mean, you could ask them, a grouping of questions that would include clinical and maybe indications for use or classification. Eric, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, the only other thing I would add on to that is don't necessarily view depending on the complexity of your device and what your information you look for, you need to look at the pre-sub process as a not necessarily one and done. In other words, you may do an initial pre-sub and then file a supplement to that pre-sub to get additional feedback. So depending on when you engage with them, but I agree with Martha, we generally limit it to no more than 5 questions. They can be different types of questions, right? And the way, just to be clear how this might work is you would ask your questions, they give you written feedback to that about 5 days in advance of your call. And then during the call, you as the sponsor would put together a slide deck that specifically details out additional information you'd like to discuss during your 1-hour meeting. So, if you have a large program, you may decide to start your pre-sub to say, hey, do I need clinical data? And if you do need clinical data, you file a follow-on supplement to your pre-sub to discuss maybe what your clinical program might look like.
Thank you. And maybe 1 or even 2 follow-up questions on that. Actually. So how many Q-subs can you request at the FDA? Is it 1 Q-sub plus supplements, or can you request multiple Q-subs?
So it's generally 1 Q sub per product, if you will, right? With supplements. So there's no limit to how many you can do. I will caution whoever asked the question that the FDA is as we are very. I like using the pre-sub process. I think it's very helpful, but sometimes companies can get into a cycle of, multiple pre-subs, and at some point you kind of have to make a decision to move forward with your submission, right? So think about this in, 2-month blocks of time, that at some point you have to, say you have enough information and move on with your submission. So there's no limit, if you will. If you have 2 different products, 2 entirely different products, and products are generally, classified by their intended use, for example. If there's different intended use, those are be considered in most cases different products, and you would do a separate pre-sub for each product.
Thank you. And how binding is the information received actually for your submission process?
That's a good question.
That's a very good question. Whoever asked that. So technically, the pre-sub is non-binding. If you read through the guidance document, they'll specifically tell you, well, this is no non-binding information. However, in my experience in using the pre-sub process, I've never really come across a situation where the FDA has not held up their end of what advice they've given you. So it's almost like a legal like caveat to say, well, this is non-binding. But generally, I've been very successful in the FDA standing by the information that they provided to you and staying with that particular guidance or that particular advice, unless they receive additional information that moves them from that position.
Yeah, that's pretty much specific to the US. If you go outside of the US, some of the regulators are more, they're, I don't want to say lenient, but you're able to have more of a discussion with them and get their ideas. More than the FDA kind of stands pretty firm on what they give you. So
I have a few more questions here, but I'll pick 2 now. And for the other ones, feel free to send your questions via email, and I can also forward them to Eric and Martha.
Okay.
Yeah, we'd be happy to answer anything via email if we don't have time here.
Yeah, so maybe one more is, how similar does a predicate device has to be if you want to apply for a 510K? So if you can maybe answer that shortly.
I'll tell you what, why don't we table that one until we get to the next section. When we get to the 510K section, we can talk to that a little bit more.
Yeah, I'll answer that in a couple slides. It's a good segue though.
Maybe one more, how does the FDA actually conduct the manufacturer inspection if you are abroad?
That's a good question. You can go ahead, Eric.
Yep. So they actually, there's what's called there is ways where you can satisfy multiple regulatory bodies for the inspection process. There is a program where you can, it includes Europe, the US and Canada. However, if you're not part of that program, the FDA will include, even though you're not in the US, the FDA will come over and audit you periodically, regardless of your geographic location.
Yeah, usually they give you, usually they are auditing for a week-ish, depends on how busy they are, but typically in my experience they've been there about a week, and they give you notification a couple months in advance if you're a foreign manufacturer. Yeah,
they're pre-planned, and they have that what's called the NDSAP program, and you guys can check that out, where they share they share facility inspection results so that you don't have multiple people coming into your facility. That's called the MDSAP program.
Yeah. Medical Device Single Audit Program. Yep. I think that's what that is. Yep.
Okay, should we move on in our?
Okay, let's move on. I'm going to go as quickly as possible. Make sure we can get everything in. Okay. So let's talk about device classification. So this is going to be specific to the US. different markets have different classifications. So let's talk about the US. So we've learned before that we have low, moderate, and high risk. That kind of matches up to the classification. Most common, of course, is class 2, 510K, of course.
Just to be clear, like 90%, I'm going to say 90% of the devices that enter the US market go through the 510K process, this class 2. It's also called 510K. It's also called pre-market notification, same thing. But this is the vast majority of products that enter the US market, you know, come through as class 2.
Yep. Let's say you're interested in your classification for your product. There is, of course, a website that you can go to, and I'm going to try to go to it now. I thought that would be more smooth than it actually is. What do we have? This is classification. You guys can see my screen still?
Yes.
Okay, great. And the links are in the presentation that I'll send you. You know what, I also put it up on the screen. But for an example, if you know your device, and I was gonna do 3 of them, but I'm not gonna do 3 anymore because of time. But let's say you're working on a stent, for an example. We can search, and it's, you know, it gives you this product code, which we're going to be covering next. But it gives you a grouping of stents out there. And over here on the right, you can see, you know, there's 3 HDEs. There's one unclassified, one not classified, and the other ones are class 3. So usually, you know, class 3 are high risk. If you embed anything or implant anything into the body, it's usually a class 3. For an example. So let's go back to here. Another example is the US product code. So we saw on the website the product code. So this kind of identifies a generic category specific to, oh, I did it again, specific to the device. So let's go to, that's my technical difficulty here. So if we go to the link here, you're going to see the product classification on the right hand side here. And if you would go in and, you know, enter in the device like the stent, it'll give you the product code. It'll give you a regulation number. And it'll give you all sorts of information, which you can see over here on the right hand side. Over here.
So there's 2, or just to be clear here, there's kind of 2 ways to kind of go about this. One is you can search on your device description, whatever, and then it will give you a product code that maybe is a little bit more definitive, right? So you'll get a classification, or there's a regulation number that will come up for your description, and then it'll give a product code. And the product code is a little bit more, you know, a little bit more definitive, and that'll lead you directly to whether you're class 1, class 2, or class 3. So in order for you to figure out which way you're really going to go with your product, you need to really hone in on what is your best method to be able to your best method to get your product to market based on its classification.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Okay, so let's go back to the presentation. So then that was the end of that section. So were there any questions on that? We kind of went through that kind of fast, but we gave you two vehicles, both on the FDA website, to kind of help you research your classification and your product code for your devices.
No specific questions for this,
okay.
at this stage.
Okay. So then let's move on to the different pathways. And this is again specific to US and FDA. Again, low classification to high classification. You know, it's the pathway that you're going to select is dependent on your risk classification. And these are also based on the level to provide reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. So, you know, if you think of a high level or a high risk classification, you know, something that's going to be implanted in your body, of course, there's going to be more requirements than if it's a lower class, it's class 1, or maybe something that's even exempt, you know, something like a tongue depressor. Of course, there's going to be different requirements for that. So class 1 exempt, similar to what I've already said. Some of the general controls that you need for a class 1 exempt, you know, good manufacturing processes, adverse event reports. You're going to need facility registration, so the FDA knows where to find your manufacturing location, you know, for those audits that we talked about. And general record keeping requirements. So you know, you want to be able to have a quality system, you know, and a document control system. So you want to be able to prove that if you would be audited by the FDA. If you search for the regulations, you know, here's an example of, you know, what the regulation might state. It'll tell you classification, class 1 general controls, and then it'll give you usually two parts of the Code of Federal Regulations that you can, you know, you can search and you can find more information on that. Some of the examples of a, you know, class 1 stethoscope, irrigating syringe, and oxygen mask. So you see that these are pretty low level, low risk devices.
So just one point and one recommendation I have, if you kind of go through this classification process, right, and you determine that your device is class 1, that means you don't need the FDA's clearance or approval to market your device,
Yeah,
right?
Good point.
However, I always advise companies to document your decision, right? So put together a note to file in your development file that details, I went through the FDA's, you know, decision making. I went through their classification. I determined I'm exempt, and here's why I determined that I'm exempt, so that if and when the FDA comes and visits your facility, they'll look at what devices you offer on the market, and you'll be able to have that rationale available to them.
Good. Now the most common, class 2, you have a 510K, so it's moderate risk. So of course you're going to have just a little more requirements than what the exempt device had. They kind of classifies those as special controls. So things like labeling requirements. Sometimes, depending on the device, you might have specific performance standards that you need to follow. And of course, device specific testing requirements as well. I think that's all I have to say about that. Eric, do you want to say anything more on this, or should I just go to the next slide?
What is your next slide? Let me just take a quick look.
It's that one.
Yeah. Nope, you can continue on.
Okay, thanks. So part of the 510K process, we're telling the FDA that there is a predicate or a similar device out there. We need to prove that devices are substantially equivalent. And there's a whole method on how to do this. So yeah, to do that, you compare your device to something that's already out in the market. And we usually do that using the technological characteristics or the same intended use. So now when you start looking for predicates or similar products out there, you really want to pay attention to that intended use. because you're kind of banking on that to prove to the FDA that your device is similar. So of course, on the bottom, you can see that there's a link to a guidance document. And the thing that you want to pay attention to in the guidance document is this flow chart. And it might be small on your screen, but it does have references to the Code of Federal Regulations on there as well. So if you just kind of think about going through this flow chart, it kind of gives you the answers as to whether or not your device really is substantially equivalent. So one of the things you want to look at is, is the predicate device legally marketed? That's key. It should be out on the market. Does the device have the same intended use? If it does, you can go to the next one. If not, it's not substantially equivalent.
Let's stop here for just a second, because I think the question that came up in the earlier in the day was, how close for an intended use does it need to be? So
okay.
The FDA does have another guidance document that talks about intended uses, but this is perhaps, the intended use is probably the most important aspect when determining substantially equivalent. You need to be fairly close, and it needs to be on a case-by-case basis. But when you think about intended use, it has to be, for example, within the same general population, right? The same general disease state, and where there are differences between the intended use does not raise new questions of safety and effectiveness. So, oftentimes I advise, companies that I work with to, if you can use the predicate device's intended use, that kind of checks the box here, right? And stay as close as you can to the intended use as possible. Doesn't mean you can't have any differences, but the closer you are, the more chances of success getting through the review process.
Yep. That's a really good point. Yep. And after you compare the intended uses, then you kind of look at the technological characteristics, which are the design materials, energy source, and all the other similarities. So I'm not going to go through the entire flow chart, but this could be here for your reference. So it's things to look at, as you're trying to determine your substantial equivalence. So there's 3 types of 510Ks. I know we're kind of getting in the weeds here, but 3 types of 510Ks. There's a traditional, an abbreviated, and a special. The special 510K is used if you are already the manufacturer for a device that's already in the market. So I wasn't going to go too in depth into the special 510K. We will be looking at that next week when we're talking about post-market and how to evaluate change. Between the traditional and the abbreviated 510K, the traditional is most common. Abbreviated, I've done one abbreviated years and years and years and years ago. It's not that common. And in the end, usually the abbreviated contains all the information that's in a traditional anyway. So like I said, the traditional 510K is the most common. And the thing in the traditional 510K, you want to give enough information to the FDA about the indications for use, like Eric was saying, and the technology. And you can get that, from the flow chart that we just looked at, all the items to think about when you're doing your substantial equivalence. You want to present that to an FDA to demonstrate that, our device is the same as this other, the predicate device. So Eric, did you want to?
Yeah, just a couple of comments here. One is to the abbreviated came about when the FDA was struggling with resources and review times were very lengthy. They added this in to allow companies to say, I'm not going to give you testing. I'm going to specifically claim compliance to a standard, right? And you can claim that compliance and not provide your testing. That was the genesis of it, but I'm with Martha. I've done in my career, I've done maybe 4 or 5 of these. It's not a very relative, at this point, especially for newer companies entering the market. Generally, you start with a traditional, 510K. My other comment on the special 510K is just that is a follow-on. When you have got your first 510K completed for your product and you make modifications to your product, there's certain modifications that can go through the special 510K process. We'll talk about that next week, but the important thing for you to know is that review is a 30-day review for a special 510K. So it's a lot quicker, whereas a traditional 510K is a 90-day review.
Yep, good comment. Yep. Let's go to the next one. So I wanted to give you a list of the content that's required, and you might not need to submit all of this content. And I did give you the link down there for the traditional and abbreviated 510K. So some of the things in my experience, I'm used to working on larger systems. We would always rely on, providing bench data. So we would always, this section right here, 18 would be huge. We would very rarely have animal or clinical. So it's really device dependent. Obviously, if your device does not have software, you're not going to have anything in the software section. But nowadays, more and more devices do have software.
So you only put in those sections that are applicable for your devices. It's very rare for a 510K to have clinical data. Not unheard of, but it doesn't happen that often. Most times it is bench testing and sometimes animal work to be able to demonstrate equivalence to your predicate device.
And if you're wondering, what is a class 3 summary and certification, if we go to the guidance, it gives you a description of each one of these sections and what should be in those sections. So I wanted to give you that reference. As far as the timeline, like Eric was saying, there's 90 days and 30 days for a special, and again, that's calendar days. So this kind of gives you a breakdown as to what happens in the FDA process. Day 1 starts when the FDA receives your 510K submission. By day 7, they send you an acknowledgement letter. If everything meets their initial standards. If it doesn't, they'll send you a hold letter and ask you to resubmit. So, there's usually send an e-copy through FedEx or UPS. You want something with a trackable number on it so you know where it is. And it's the easiest things that usually trip you up. I mean, lately I've had 1 or 2 return because it didn't meet the the initial review, and it was just a file issue, or the PDF did something weird to the file. But if it passes that, then FDA does an acceptance review, and then if they accept it, then it goes into substantive review. And then that's where the bulk of the information is. And the review is with the FDA. And then, if the FDA has any questions, they will send you, it's usually via email. It used to be via fax or a letter. They will ask questions. And when they ask questions, they kind of stop the clock until you answer those questions, just so that they can reach their goal. They do have metrics of 90 days for the review. I know we only have just a couple minutes left, so I'm just going to go high level. Eric, is there any comments that you wanted to say on this?
We're good.
Okay. And again, this information will be in your packets. De novo, I don't think I want to go through, but it's here. here for you
I'll
guys?
just quickly a comment on De
Okay.
Novo, right? This is bridges the gap between a 510K and a PMA, right? PMAs are just the most difficult class 3. They take years to execute with the FDA. Difficult way to market. A De Novo is where you do not have a predicate device clearly defined, right? But yet you're still a low and moderate risk device. This is a pathway to market for you to say, I'm going to create a new classification, even though there isn't one, and you'll be able to get your product through the market as a class 2, generally as a class 2 device once it gets classified. So the end result of this process is you essentially meet the requirement of a class 2 device, you get a new classification, and you get a substantially equivalent letter or a reclassification letter for your product. So this kind of bridges the gap between a traditional 510K and a PMA.
Yep, thank you. And then the timeline here, it's a little more drawn out because I think it's the FDA needs a little more time to, because it's not, you're not given a classification, so they need time to research that and to kind of place you and give you a classification. Humanitarian use. I'm just going to put this in the packet so you have it for a reference going forward. And like Eric was saying, the pre-market application, the PMA class 3, usually has to do with very high class, high risk class devices, implantable stents, automatic defibrillators, things like that are class 3. These are, it takes so much work, and if you would look and print out a PMA, it takes reams and reams and reams of paper for this. So this is, it's a lot of work.
It's a difficult pathway for a lot of folks to enter, and you need to kind of think about, is the market really there for your class 3 device to really go down this road?
Yeah, it takes a lot of work, and the cost associated with it is pretty high. I wanted to give you an idea of the submission timelines. I won't go through this because of time, but it kind of gives you accepted, not accepted, and the days that it takes. And you see way over here, it can take, was it 180 days to 320 days? It's
Right.
it's about a year.
Mm-hmm. Once you submit all the information.
Yeah, and this isn't FDA coming back and asking questions and asking for clarification.
Right. This is all the information. These are generally randomized controlled clinical trials using hundreds of subjects. So that kind of breadth of data is required.
Yep. And then finally, I wanted to give you guys an idea of the cost associated with some of the submissions. And this, I just pulled these 3 out as a gauge. So FDA was, I think, it was really nice as part of MDUFA, and I couldn't even tell you what year because that came out because it's not on the top of my head. But they came up with a small business fee. So if you are a small business, you can see the decrease in cost is significant. Especially for a PMA, it's huge. But this changes every year. So the FDA's fiscal year, it starts in October or end of September, early October, and goes, to the following. And this is updated every year. So the link I gave you down here will help you if you just want to check it out and see how much money, for example, a 510K is little over 3,000 if you're a small business fee. If you're a small business, if you're not a small business, 12,000. I remember when it was a little over 3,000 back in the day. But yeah, these costs increase quite significantly over time.
Okay, are we about done? What is our final? Yeah, so these are the other resources. I want to just, I think I saw some questions come through.
Okay.
Maybe if we want to quickly grab those, Anik, if you have any.
Yes, sure, absolutely. There were a couple of questions. So, for example, one specific one here is how likely is that the FDA requests clinical studies conducted in the US for a de novo device?
My experience is de novo devices, a vast majority of de novo devices require clinical data. Now, that's not always the case, but I'm going to say, 75, 80% will generally require clinical data to demonstrate that the risk is low to moderate risk for your device. So it's very common to have clinical data for de novo. Oftentimes that data is not necessarily what we call like, class 1 data. Sometimes it's not randomized, concurrently controlled. Sometimes you can have a smaller data set, a smaller sample size to be able to demonstrate, any questions of safety and effectiveness.
Thank you. Another question is, can you explain about breakthrough device designation and what the process is, and if you still need to apply for 510K or de novo afterwards?
Good question.
So that's probably a little bit, whoever that is, I think maybe you could send them my, send them their email. I will say just quickly about the breakthrough designation. Number one is it is somewhat difficult to get. You need to meet specific criteria. And what that does is it expedites your process. It really gives you more access to the FDA and gives you more ability to schedule what you call sprint meetings to define your path and get through your regulatory process. You still need to go through one of these routes to market, regardless of whether it's a breakthrough device or not. Right? The breakthrough device just allows you greater access and supposedly increases the time to get your submission through the approval process with FDA.
Another question is a little bit, not so much about the medical devices, but for digital products which are not intervening, but are still are being used to give a diagnosis. So, for example, the digital product has a sensor or is a mobile app or has some image recognition. Would that be considered a class 1?
That is a, it's hard for me to, to answer, without more information. Generally, if you're talking about diagnosing, if you're just, I'll give you an example. If you have an app that is just a method to move information from one person to another, maybe that's a class 1. If you have an app that is helping in fact diagnose or doing some type of diagnostic or that type of thing, then that would probably be, more of a class 2. But this is where the determining your classification we talked in the second part of the session should be, should be completed. And again, if you email Martha or I, we'd be happy to kind of help you through that process a little bit for you.
Yeah. You get the typical regulatory answer is it depends.
It depends. Right. That's true.
Yeah.
Good. Maybe there's one more and then I'll let you go if that is still okay. So what about if there exists a specific FDA guidance document for your product? Would you then recommend to go through a traditional or abbreviated 510K process? Is that easily answerable or email?
So you're saying if they do have a guidance document available?
Yeah, for your product, yes.
You can consider going through the abbreviated, if you feel like everything's defined. Again, I don't see that much value, in all honesty, of an abbreviated. The cost is still the same. I feel like sometimes you can have a better chance of success just using the traditional, but abbreviated in that case might be a consideration.
Yeah, you'd have to do your conformity to the consensus standard. But I mean, that's just an attestation part of the submission to the FDA, but you wanted to really make sure that you conform to the guidance or the standard.
Wonderful. One last quick question. How much does a Q-sub cost?
That's a good question because the Q-sub is free.
Yay.
So again, I'm a big fan of the Q-sub process in general, but don't let that drag out your timeline, right? But it's no cost to you other than the preparation of the documentation, right? Of putting together a comprehensive package of information to convey, to the FDA what your product is doing, how it's used, etc.
Wonderful.
Yeah, you can really get a feel for the FDA as to where their decision's going to land through the Q-sub process. It's you get the non-verbal cues sometimes from the FDA where it's always good to have a discussion with the FDA, I think. So I take full opportunity with that.
Yeah, it increases your chances of having a successful submission, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Martha, Eric, thank you very much for this very interesting and insightful presentation, for sharing all the knowledge, the insights that you have, for staying also much longer than expected.
Happy to do. We ran over a
That's
little
fine.
bit, but
I
nice
know.
job, Martha. Thank you for doing that. And I think we have the attendee list, so we'll send out the slides to everyone so that they have them and have our contact information should you have questions.